Our biggest fear is that one of us could get sick tomorrow. Everyone in this community is on borrowed time.
On June 27, 1945, a small plane took off from Wendover Airfield, an airbase on a salt flat along the Utah-Nevada border, leaving for Tinian, an island in the northern Marianas. For months, they'd been practicing, dropping payloads over the desert. With the exception of the pilot, the crew had no idea what exactly they were training for. 2 weeks later, they would learn of their mission, and that very day would step back aboard the Enola Gay for its most consequential flight. Not only did the bombing of Hiroshima, followed by the bombing of Nagasaki, completely obliterate two Japanese cities and end the war in the Pacific, but it ushered in a new Cold War, and with it a decades-long arms race, a competition between two great powers that, should it escalate too far, could threaten nothing less than nuclear Armageddon. The world we live in now, this atomic age, arguably began with that fateful flight over Hiroshima, but it's a world that was very much made in America. The atom bomb and the horrors that it has unleashed, is a story not just of a global game of chess being played out in the halls of power in Washington and Moscow, in Tokyo and London and Berlin. It's also a story of ordinary people who, much like the residents of Wendover, Utah, had no idea what was going on in their own backyard. Across America, in Hanford, in Los Alamos, in Oak Ridge, and at the Trinity test site, the components of this instrument of devastation were being built and tested in secret. And while those stories are well known, far from the desert to the west, in what was then the 8th largest city in America, the hasty and secretive construction of the atom bomb has had consequences that are still being reckoned with. In many ways, St. Louis, Missouri is not just the gateway to the West, but an atomic city, where the safety of its residents all too often came second, both before the war and in the decades since. This is that story. Wartime St. Louis was one of the largest cities in the United States, an industrial powerhouse that had hosted the World's Fair and become a major destination for immigrants from across the globe. But beneath the surface, problems were brewing. Redlining was seeing the city become deeply segregated, and after the war, much of St. Louis's upper classes would flock to leafy suburbs in outlying St. Louis County. Deindustrialization would strike another blow to the manufacturing giant. In every census since 1950, St. Louis would record fewer residents than a decade before. Parts of the city began to suffer from severe disinvestment. It was these parts of the urban area, particularly the north side of the city and its northern suburbs, that would suffer the brunt of negligence and even intentional experimentation at the hands of the federal government. On August 2, 1939, Albert Einstein penned a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, addressing the recent discovery of fission, the splitting of atoms. He wrote,
"Sir, some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard, which has been communicated to me by manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Certain aspects of the situation which has arisen seem to call for watchfulness and, if necessary, quick action on the part of the administration."
Later on in the letter he wrote,
"This new phenomena would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, may very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs may very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air."
Less than a month after Einstein wrote The President, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 would bring the United States into the global conflict, and a few months after, the President would indeed follow Einstein's advice and take quick action on the part of the administration. One of the scientists recruited early on to work on the construction of an atomic bomb as part of the top-secret Manhattan Project was the University of Chicago's Arthur Holly Compton. The Manhattan Project needed purified uranium metal, but as of yet, no one was able to purify the enormous quantity that the U.S. needed. Compton had been in charge of the physics department at St. Louis's Washington University before coming to Chicago, and he went back to his old city where he met a man for lunch downtown. The two had a brief conversation before they shook hands. The man Compton had met with? St. Louis pharmaceutical industrialist Edward Mallinckrodt. Over the course of lunch, he'd promised that his Mallinckrodt Chemical Works would be able to purify the uranium the Manhattan Project needed. Right there in downtown St. Louis, Mallinckrodt would convert uranium ore, shipped in from mines in the Belgian Congo, into refined uranium metal and oxide using ether, a material they frequently made use of in the pharmaceutical industry for use by the Manhattan Project, handled by workers who had no idea what it would be used for and little knowledge of how to handle uranium safely. Soon, they would be processing 1 ton of uranium every single day. The dropping of the bombs, the end of the war, was far from the end of Mallinckrodt's role in uranium production. With the Cold War underway, the U.S. began producing hundreds, eventually thousands, of nuclear weapons in the years following Japan's surrender, and Mallinckrodt already had the means to refine uranium ore. And their facility downtown, as well as an atomic energy commission plant in the nearby suburb of Weldon Spring, where they moved production to after a few years, Mallinckrodt pumped out more than 100,000 tons of uranium on behalf of the United States from the outset of the Manhattan Project until 1957, a decade and a half later. The ore they processed and refined also contained radium and thorium, and left over from the purification process was a highly radioactive mix of residue, nuclear waste that the federal government hoped to send back to the Belgian Congo. In the meantime, they decided they would store it nearby until it could be shipped back out. In 1946, the War Department purchased a plot of land right here near St. Louis's Lambert International Airport. Here they told Mallinckrodt to keep the nuclear waste in steel drums. It wasn't just Mallinckrodt's radioactive residue. They would store dangerous nuclear substances brought in from everywhere from upstate New York to sand from Japan contaminated with radioactive fallout, right here in suburban St. Louis. Within just a few years, the barrels began to rust and decay, the contents seeping out onto the ground. Some of the waste had simply been hauled in on trucks and dumped in a pile. Many of the workers had packed it in the barrels by hand. It wasn't completely clear just how dangerous these radioactive substances were at the time, but still, safety of both the workers and those who lived near the site was rarely given a second thought. Even then, though, Mallinckrodt determined that the waste was too dangerous to be transported away from the site. Perhaps most telling of this indifference to the impacts the nuclear waste could have was the fact that the site at the airport sat right along a small stream called Coldwater Creek, which follows a path north through suburbs like Florissant before flowing out into the Missouri River. Along its course, it passed businesses, homes, churches, even an elementary school, Jana Elementary. Coldwater Creek flowed through backyards. People lived and made their homes along its waters. Children grew up playing in the creek, splashing in its swimming holes, jumping off of rope swings. All this time, for decades, they were unknowingly swimming in, living on top of, nuclear waste as it leached out of the steel drums by Lambert Airport and deposited itself, year after year, in the soils and sediments along the banks of Coldwater Creek, or was picked up by wind and rain. Some of the waste from the Weldon Spring site was dumped in a quarry on site as well. In 1965, the site by the airport alone was found to contain 121,000 tons of nuclear waste. The following year, the government canceled its contract and Mallinckrodt stopped processing uranium, but the damage was already done. That same year, some waste from the airport site was buried in the ground at the site, while other residue was purchased by a private company and shipped to another location, on a street called Laddie Avenue in nearby Hazelwood. The Laddie Avenue site, believe it or not, also sat right on Coldwater Creek, where, open to the elements, it continued to pollute the waters downstream with hazardous nuclear waste. There, a company called the Cotter Corporation took the nuclear residue and dried it for shipment to Canyon City, Colorado, whose residents would eventually sue Cotter for mishandling and even losing some of the waste brought there. By 1973, Cotter had processed and moved everything that was valuable to them away from Laddie Avenue and the airport site. Along the route, they spilled material. A report stated that a, quote,
survey of Pershing Road, Hazelwood Avenue, and McDonald Boulevard, which indicated very spotty contamination, existed outside of the St. Louis Airport site fence. Along Pershing Road near Coldwater Creek and along Hazelwood Avenue near Laddie Avenue.
Cotter was left with barium sulfate, a nuclear residue containing both uranium and thorium, 8,700 tons of it to be precise. At Laddie Avenue, they dug up the top 1.5 feet of dirt from the site, 39,000 tons of soil in total, and mixed the barium sulfate with it. Truckload by truckload, they brought it to a nearby landfill called Westlake, and passing it off as nothing more than dirt, dumped it in, illegally disposing of nuclear waste in a public landfill. Thousands of tons of nuclear waste had by now been shipped and stored throughout St. Louis and its northern suburbs during the 30 years following the onset of the Manhattan Project. The Atomic Energy Commission discovered the illegal dumping at the Westlake landfill the next year, but did nothing. They believed, wrongly, that enough dirt had been mixed with the nuclear waste that it was practically harmless. Cotter was let off scot-free. The EPA, too, believed that just by capping Westlake like it was any other landfill, its contents could be stored safely, and they undertook tests that underreported the extent to which radioactive waste was located within the landfill. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, though, would disagree. In 1988, their research found that Westlake was indeed quite hazardous to both the environment and people who live nearby. Eventually, the EPA would declare it to be a Superfund site, placing it under their responsibility to manage and clean up. Westlake remains to this day a disaster waiting to happen. Even now, there is uncertainty as to how much radioactive waste is actually in the landfill. Supposedly, the waste from the Laddie Avenue site was only dumped in one specific area, but in 1978, a flyover survey recorded radiation in 2 separate areas of the landfill. At the Bridgeton landfill, directly adjacent to it, an underground fire broke out in 2008. It's been burning to this very day, and the earthen cap on the landfill has sunk noticeably since the fire began. Some worry that Bridgeton 2 may contain radioactive material, but to test it would mean drilling into the landfill, potentially introducing oxygen to the underground fire, which could have disastrous results. This possibility, or the possibility of the fire reaching Westlake itself, is why an emergency plan is in place for the purpose, quote, to save lives in the event of a catastrophic event at the Westlake landfill. A plan for remediation of the St. Louis sites was put into place in 1990, by which point Coldwater Creek had already been designated one of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States. Along much of its 14-mile course, surface-level radiation has been discovered. It's been found in parks, under homes, in people's backyards. In 2016, the CDC told residents of the area to avoid the creek altogether. Jana Elementary School, which sat right along the creek, closed its doors in 2023 due to rising concerns about student safety being so close to its waters. Still, though, no signs have gone up along Coldwater Creek, warning of the radioactive material that's located all throughout soil along its floodplain. For many people who grew up along the creek, who swam in its waters, played in the park as kids, or raised their families in the neighborhood as adults, cancer is an all too common occurrence. Progress has been made, if incrementally. The cleanup will take a long time, though it is underway. There is likely more contaminated material along the stream that is yet to be found, and even so, with radioactive material not just located within the Westlake landfill or beneath the airport and Laddie Avenue sites, but strewn across the banks and floodplains of a 14-mile-long body of water, cleanup isn't expected to be complete until 2038. The story of the Manhattan Project in St. Louis isn't even the full story of the trail of devastation left behind by the push to construct nuclear weapons within the United States. Nor is it the only example of the horrible human toll the Cold War had on St. Louis. Look no further than Pruitt-Igoe, a low-income housing project in the north side of the city, where the Army secretly sprayed FP226 on the complex to test how particulates could spread in a potential chemical attack on the U.S. 70% of residents in the complex at the time were under 12 years old. A study conducted using St. Louis children's baby teeth discovered that children who grew up at the height of the Cold War in 1963 had 50 times as much strontium-90 in their teeth as children born in 1950. Advocacy groups like Just Moms STL speak out on behalf of the many people in St. Louis who remain victims, decades and decades later, to the unsafe storage and handling of the Manhattan Project's byproducts that has torn a path of destruction through the city ever since. An important step forward would be the renewal of RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provides funds to those whose health has been impacted by exposure to nuclear radiation. The act needs to be renewed and expanded to include states like Missouri, whose residents as of now would not qualify to receive its compensation. The people whose lives have been upended by Westlake, by Coldwater Creek, they have been crying out for their story to be heard. Share it if you can. Share the work of Just Moms. Call your representatives and senators and ask for RECA to be renewed and expanded to other states. The founders of Just Moms shared with us the quote that this video began with, that everyone in their community is living on borrowed time. Help ensure that their story, at least, is one that will not be forgotten.